Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Superman 2. Unlike Superman the movie, I actually grew up watching Superman 2 quite a few times. It was one of those films that was kind of in constant rotation on my TV set as a kid with the Star Wars trilogy and Ghostbusters and the Disney films. This was always on there. I wouldn't say this film is perfect, but despite a lot of its flaws, it's actually a very strong movie. It definitely has like major problems with it, but it's such a good movie. It's the first great superhero sequel. It sometimes can be a mixed bag because there's a lot of really bad superhero sequels, but there's a lot of really good superhero sequels. And I think a superhero sequel that is a lot stronger written than this film, but has a lot of similarities with it, is Spider-Man 2, especially with Superman giving up his powers. And when Superman gives up his powers, in this film, it's very random. It never really gets in the way of his relationship with Lois, except for the scene at Niagara Falls. It never really gets in the way of his life, you know, the Superman identity, except for the Niagara Falls scene, and they don't really build it. And it does feel like they cut away to what's going on with Zod, and then they cut back. Suddenly he's like, I'm going to give up my powers. A lot of the problems with this film, as it appears to be like a bad screenplay, it's really just because they had two different directors. It was originally shot at the same time as Superman the movie, or a majority of it was, and then they took like a 2-year break, and the producers of this film decided to fire Richard Donner, and had already shot a good portion of Superman 2 and decided to hire Richard Lester, who was most famous for A Hard Day's Night, and apparently didn't even know who Superman was before doing this movie. It still works out. I still think it works really well as a summer movie. It's actually closer to a superhero movie now than Superman the movie, because Superman the movie is trying to be like an epic big Hollywood event film, and Superman 2 is trying to be a newer summer blockbuster tentpole. And there's a big difference between look at a summer blockbuster and look at a Gone with the Wind type of movie. So I think Superman 2 is a lot easier to take down actually than Superman the movie, because it's so much closer to the kind of films we are used to as a modern audience. Even though I've seen Superman 2 a bazillion gazillion times and I love it, I own it on DVD, I've never seen the Richard Donner cut. I'm kind of interested in seeing the Richard Donner cut to see what the difference is and what that film is like. Part of me is afraid I won't like it, and I like Superman 2 so much, but I understand like the flaws in it. Like the scene in Paris at the beginning with the hydrogen bomb is superfluous, because really they shot apparently the missile being flown into space from the first film that frees Zod, Nod, and Ursa. For some reason they needed to redo that. I don't really understand the method behind that one, because you're already recapping, I mean, the first film at the beginning. Why not show that? But the Paris sequence is really cool. I really like the Paris sequence. That's very much like a modern blockbuster. Let's start a sequel off with a really, really cool action sequence to get you right in there. Brando didn't want to appear in this film, I think because of Donner wasn't there. A lot of actors are very protective over Donner, and if Richard Donner's not involved in a sequel of a film he's going to do, most actors don't want to work on it. Mel Gibson and Danny Glover won't do a Lethal Weapon film without Richard Donner, and I've heard that a lot of times with Richard Donner. People are like, well, if he's not involved, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And Richard Donner is a great director. I mean, he went on to do Lethal Weapon, he did Superman the movie, did The Omen, and I can understand that. And Brando actually sued the producers of the film and actually got a cut of this movie even though he wasn't in it. And so none of his scenes appear in this film, even in the summary at the beginning. So I grew up not even knowing who Superman's dad was. I just thought he had a mom who put him in a ship. And it's interesting that they had to completely reshoot the trial sequence. And in this film, it's like they do the crime and then suddenly the trial just happens right there. It seems more of a creepy, futuristic society that suddenly you can be tried right after committing a crime, like supposedly they show in this film. It works really for flow because you don't want to see them go through the long logistic process of Krypton. That's the thing about Brando not appearing in this film. He did shoot scenes for this film, which were later used in Superman Returns, and the scenes are in the Richard Donner cut, which now I feel like while I'm shooting this, I really should have seen. There's a lot of scenes that just kind of are in there because they had to reshoot things. They had to reshoot exact scenes that Richard Donner did for the Directors Guild to give Richard Lester credit. The interesting thing about the Richard Donner thing also is that I read a few older reviews about it, and most of them don't seem to know that Richard Donner was fired and some of this was shot by him. They credit Richard Lester with the whole movie. So I'm wondering how long it took for anyone to actually know about Richard Donner directing parts of this film. I'm wondering when that came out, or if it was known and the critics didn't know, or what the deal was. But I noticed in Roger Ebert's review, he credits Richard Lester with the whole movie, and it's really two directors. instead of 1. Apparently Richard Donner's film is a lot darker and more brooding, but I feel like this film still has kind of a darker, brooding quality. It means so much more when someone just like wants to rule and take over because of their crazy, insane ego, like a Hitler type of scenario, rather than if they have like kind of a darker reason. And Lex Luthor in the first film has an economic reason, isn't as scary as a crazy belief system like Zod and Nod and Ursa have. They're such scary villains, but I think also because they're the first real supervillains. So I'm not demoting Lex Luthor or anything, but he doesn't have a power, certainly. You know, I think there's a difference between a villain who, you know, has great economic resources and has reasoning than having a superhero fight a super villain. And this is really the first super villain in that way kind of movie. In any sequel film, like a James Bond movie or any superhero sequel film, focuses on the villain. And what great villains to focus on, because they shot half a part of the movie 2 years before the other part. And so there's certain cuts where you're like, whoa, Margot Kidder looks drastically different, or Superman looks bulkier, or, you know, there's certain cuts you can tell that. But for the most part, I think it's pretty hard to tell. Gene Hackman would only do work with Richard Donner, so all of his stuff is from the Richard Donner shoot, not from the later shoot. I think the reason I like this so much as a kid is it moves, it has action in it. This is a sequel that's far more concerned with action than the original film. The original film is really about Superman and building up the character, and this film's still about Superman and actually keeps, unlike the second Iron Man, unlike a lot of sequel superhero films that aren't as, they're far more concerned with the villain and usually get crowded with villains. And this film has two villains. It has Lex Luthor and Ursa, Nod, and Zod, and like that's a lot of villains. I mean, you can count them as the three of those guys maybe as one villain, I guess, but it has multiple villains. A lot of films like that, they get lost. You don't have that kind of that internal conflict, or if you do, it doesn't feel as prominent as it does in this film. And even though it's not built as well as like a Spider-Man 2 would do later, where it's very clear that Spider-Man is getting in the way of his relationship with Mary Jane, Superman, it doesn't feel that way, but there's definitely an internal conflict within him, despite kind of the poor writing or the poor editing or whatever you want to call it that's in the film. I still like that conflict with that, the infamous diner scene that's so threatening, and that part always seems scary to me. I mean, when I was a kid, I'm not seeing too much scary stuff, so that seemed very scary and threatening, but it does feel very threatening because, like, man, Superman just got beat up. It gets away from kind of the lighter tone that you're kind of associated with Superman. The problem with Superman is he becomes like too perfect, he becomes too unbeatable, so he's not as interesting of a character really. As a kid, when I read comics, I read Marvel comics, and one of the reasons, and I read Batman, but the reason I didn't read Superman was because there's not really a conflict to me. There didn't feel like a conflict to me. I knew he could always win because he's Superman. And this represented more of a conflict. And even as someone who wasn't a big Superman fan, I always loved this movie. That's kind of the sign of a great superhero movie. It's kind of like the original Iron Man. No one knew who Iron Man was before that movie came out, and it didn't really matter to them that it was Iron Man. It mattered to them that it was a good movie and a good story. And to me, that's what makes Superman 2 so special, is because I wasn't into Superman, but I was into Superman 2. And that says a lot about it as a movie. When I watched the first one, I wasn't humming the theme to Superman because it didn't represent as much. And then when I saw Superman 2, I was humming the theme and I was making my cats be super cats. To me, Superman 2 was why I liked Superman as a kid. And even though I was more of a Spider-Man fan, I was more of a Marvel fan, that didn't matter because I just love this movie, and I've always loved this movie. And, you know, I think it's because I grew up with Star Wars, and Star Wars had a strong villain, and Zod is a hell of a strong villain. It's interesting he doesn't say much, but it's just his actions, his presence is scary as hell. Without Zod, I don't think this movie would be what it is. And that's why he's become such a memorable villain, and even why they're making Zod be in the new Man of Steel. Ursa and Nod just really come off as sidekicks. They're really second to Zod, because Zod is scary. Zod is an evil, evil guy, and he has kind of like a Hitler element to him. The idea, I think, of a superpowered person who isn't a good person, who's an evil person, who has bad intentions, who wants to conquer the earth and rule over everyone. And it does feel more like a comic book than the first film. I know Richard Lester, that was his intent, to like shoot it more like a comic book. I think they succeeded. It flows more like a comic book. It feels more like one of the Marvel movies and less like the Superman. Superman the movie is really kind of a different way to go about it, and I feel like Superman 2 is trying more like a comic book. And a lot of films, I don't think a film would successfully get the comic book tone until like Batman. This is the movie, and the reason I love the Superman movies is because of this, and even love Superman. It's not trying to be a big, epic, kind of almost Oscar-y type movie. movie. It's like, well, it's Superman 2. Let's have some fun. Let's thrill the audience. And that almost works better for it than it did trying to take it seriously with Superman the movie. And this was actually the first Superman movie released in the summer. The last one was released in December. This was released in the summer. The first one was just delayed, so because they took too long to make it. So if you have seen Superman 2 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. One of the things I was thinking about when I'm doing the Superman reviews was originally I thought about doing Superman Returns or Superman 3 or 4, and I know a lot of people are doing that, and I kind of thought, well, what was the thing I liked about Superman? So I thought I'd review the Superman shorts from the 40s, and I'm going to do that in 2 different videos because it was done by 2 different studios. So I'm going to do the Fleischer Superman films and then the famous Superman films. The Fleischer Superman films, that will come out tomorrow, and thank you for watching.